My name is Jim O'Connell. I am a senior resource educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Ulster County. I do with the most of it berries and grapes, but I'm also part of the Climate Smart Farming team, which is a program at Cornell University. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Jennifer Phillips from Bard College. Dr. Phillips is a professor of science at the Bard Center for Environmental Policy and teaches in the Master Science, Climate Science and Policy degree program. She also owns and operates a sustainable livestock operation in Clermont, New York. Just before turning this over to her, I just want to add a couple of things. If you have any questions about during the presentation, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them. We'll kind of group them together and get to them as appropriate. A special shout out to my colleague, Jason Detzel, for introducing me to Dr. Phillips. Jason Detzel works with me we work together in the Cornell CCE office in Ulster County. He's the senior ag educator for livestock. So anytime I have questions about sheep, goats, maybe even things to weed in between perennial berry crops, I talk with him. So he introduced me to Dr. Phillips. Dr. Phillips is our guest speaker today to talk about understanding climate change and its impact on local agriculture. As more and more we get into this changing environment and changing climate, I thought it was appropriate and important to have an expert come talk to everybody and present on some of the things that she's been doing and what she knows. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Phillips and mute myself and shut off my video.
Thank you. Maybe I'll turn my video on here too. I just need to share my screen, and can you stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine, please?
Right, yeah, I was looking for the button. Here we go, stop share.
Okay. Let's see here. So thanks very much for inviting me. I've known Jason for a little while and just met Jim recently, so thanks to both of them for inviting me today. Let me go into show mode here. If I can get this to move out of the way so I can see it. Here we go. Okay, good. So today I'm going to talk about not seeing moving forward. I'll use that key. Okay. From what I understand, there are a variety of different sort of expertises on the line here. Some of you are with Cooperative Extension, others are farmers, and then still others are perhaps gardeners and just interested in climate change. So I thought I'd begin with some of the very basic science super briefly. Then I'm going to present a little bit more extensively on what the latest models and observational analysis are saying about climate change here in the Northeast. So we have a sense of what we're preparing for. Then I'll move on to this concept of building resilience in farming systems. I'm going to particularly focus on soil carbon and diversification. So just the basics here, as most of you know, sorry, there's something, it's asking me to admit people. Am I supposed to be doing that before I can proceed? I think.
Yeah, I'll take care of that. You focus on the presentation. Jason and I will handle things in the background.
Okay, good. Shortwave radiation is coming from the sun, and our atmosphere is transparent to shortwave radiation. So that's energy coming into the Earth system. And as it strikes the surface, it heats things up, and then we're re-emitting in the long wave. So it turns out that our atmosphere is not transparent to long wave radiation. So that's the idea behind the greenhouse effect, where shortwave comes in, but it can't get back out once it's transmitted to long wave radiation. So it's a good thing to some degree, because if we didn't have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, the Earth would be too cold for us to live. We need greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And of course, for quite a long while, it's been such that that was providing perfect temperatures for us. Unfortunately, we're we've added enough greenhouse gases to the atmosphere that we're no longer at those optimal temperatures. Just reviewing quickly, carbon dioxide isn't the only greenhouse gas we're worried about. It's the primary one that we generally tend to be concerned with. But of course, both methane and nitrous oxide are the other really important greenhouse gases. And these are ones that are much more powerful per molecule than carbon dioxide. So it turns out that, in fact, agriculture is the main source of methane and nitrous oxide, certainly nitrous oxide from fertilizer use. So I won't be spending any more time on that aspect of the equation today, but we need to be thinking as we transition to a more sustainable agriculture, it's not only how agriculture can handle climate change, but how climate change is influencing, how agriculture is influencing the greenhouse gas emissions. So if we actually have data going back 800,000 years now, this data is coming from ice cores that are drilled in the Greenland ice sheet. And if we extract the carbon dioxide level in the bubbles that were captured when that snow fell up to 800,000 years ago, we can see here that it's been quite a while that the Earth was managing at around no higher than 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But also, as you can see, it's just within the 20th century that we've really started to increase that number. So the current levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, just as of December, just last month, we're at 414 parts per million. So we've crossed that important threshold of 400 parts per million just within this past year, and the numbers are continuing to go up. Many of you might have noticed just last week, NASA announced their results of their analysis on temperatures for 2020, and announced that in fact 2020 tied with 2016 as the warmest year on record. So as you can see from this graphic, the gray line is the trace of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then the bars are global average temperatures. And since 1880, of course, we've increased those temperatures steadily, and particularly since the 1970s. That's been the most dramatic increase. I noted here what the atmospheric CO2 was in 1988. Some of you may be aware that 1988 was the year that Jim Hansen, who was the director of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, testified in Congress that indeed we understand the physics well enough to know that if we keep increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we're going to create an Earth that's uninhabitable by humans. And by the year 2000, we'd gone up just a little bit more to 2069. But here we are 20 years later, and the numbers are, the rate of increase is increasing. So that's not a good thing. If we project out into the future, the scientists that run general circulation models or global climate models are sort of have agreements through the UN to utilize standard scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions into the future so that everybody's kind of running the same assumptions in their models. And in this first graphic, we can see on the left, what's considered the high scenario, in other words, kind of the worst case scenario, is called RCP 8.5, relative concentration pathway, and the 8.5 refers to the change in watts per meter squared of the energy balance of the planet. So you don't really need to know that, but I will be referring to RCP 8.5 and RCP 4.5 later in the talk. So keep in mind that we're referring to kind of the worst case scenario, and what they're calling here the lower scenario, which would be what we're really shooting for now. And then they've included on here even an even lower scenario, but no one is thinking that we'll be able to turn things around this quickly now. So the RCP 2.6 is not even often looked at now because it's such an unrealistic scenario for curbing our emissions. So when we look to the figure on the right, those using these greenhouse gas emission scenarios and then running our general circulation models with those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we can see that by the end of the century, we're under the high scenario, we're at about 4 degrees centigrade higher, which is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher. So that's a global average. In the hopeful and realistic scenario, the lower scenario, we're keeping it under 2 degrees C. So that's a goal for the climate community at present, to try to keep that. I mean, we're actually trying to shoot for under 1.5, but we'll see which of those is realistic. The key lessons I think that I want to stress here, I mean, all of us know that temperature is going up, but the key lessons that we've really become aware of over the last 20 years are that, first of all, this is all happening a lot faster than we used to think. I remember 88 was also the year I started my graduate studies at Cornell. And I remember thinking that, all of these discussions about climate change, we were talking about 2050 and 2100, and we won't really start seeing it until our children or children's children. But that's totally not what's happening now. These two pictures depict scenes from this summer. So this is fires in Northern California, wine country, that were just devastating this past summer, and then floods in March in the Midwest. And so the rate of change is far higher than we expected. The other big take-home lesson from the last 20 years is that it's really all about these extreme events. If you think about it, if we knew exactly how much warmer next year was going to be, and the year after that, and the year after that, and things were just changing in sort of a smooth, delta 2 degrees fashion, it's fairly easy to plan for that. But as all of you who are involved in farming know, it's not knowing exactly what each season is going to be like that's really hard. About, climate variability is probably the biggest challenge for farmers. And what's happening with climate change is that variability is getting stronger. We're seeing more and more extremes as time goes on. So that's really where the challenges lie. So let's look at some specific data. I mean, there isn't a whole lot of modeling that's really specific to the Northeast, because the general circulation models do a very good job at these sort of big areas. It's harder when you try to narrow that down to very specific areas. So certainly we don't have projections for just the Hudson Valley, but we can still glean some information from the next number of slides I'm going to show are coming from the United States Global Change Research Program, which interestingly was able to fly under the radar in 2018. The Trump administration threatened to stop the publication of this report, but it was able to get through with very little censorship. And based on the results from that study, here in the Northeast, our expected, based on the observations over the last 50 years or so, we've seen about 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase. When we go to the projections for the future, in the mid-century under the RCP 4.5, so in other words, that lower scenario, we're looking at 3 to 4 degrees increase here in the Northeast. But if we sort of look at the other extreme, late century higher scenario, we're talking, up to 9 or 10 degrees increase in temperature in the Northeast. And that would be, these are annual averages. So this is, South Carolina kind of weather. So we're hoping that we don't end up on the track of the RCP 8.5 here. If we look at precipitation, based on the observations that we have seen an increase in precipitation. So the annual average for the observations is 5 to 15% increase in the latter part of the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, relative to the early part of the 20th century. All of you are somewhat aware of that, I think, based on your experience with farming. The predictions don't vary a lot from that. And I will note that the general circulation models are notoriously bad at doing precipitation. It's a lot easier for the climate modelers to give us good numbers on the change in temperature than it is to look at the change in precip. It's just a harder feature to model. But nonetheless, what the models are saying is that the bulk of the change in precipitation that we're going to experience here in the Northeast will occur for winter and spring. So that increase in precipitation we're talking about is a seasonal issue, where the idea that summer and fall will also see increase in precip, there's a lot more uncertainty. These hash marks on here refer to how much uncertainty there is in the model output. So the expectation nonetheless is for more precip, primarily winter and spring. But again, more importantly, the data is showing that the observations show that the extremes are increasing as well. If we look at the data for the Northeast here and comparing all of the 20th century to just the recent period, the latter half of the 20th century, what we're showing in these figures is the amount of the total precipitation that has fallen in those heavy extreme events. In other words, for this figure here, 38% of all the rainfall that came within a year fell as those few heavy events that are in the 1 percentile of all events. That number increased to 55%. So now the more recent data is showing that 55% of the rainfall that we're getting is coming as these extreme events. So that gives you a clue as to how we may need to be thinking about managing precipitation. The models are showing similar results for going into the latter part of the century. They're not showing us much more than what our observations are already showing us. So in these cases, we're looking at, maybe 40% or more of our rainfall will be in those high rainfall events. But the models are underscoring this idea that rainfall is going to come as extremes. And of course, most of you remember, it's been a decade now. It was 2011 when Hurricanes Lee and Irene fell in that same fall. And those were the most extreme rainfall events that we've had here in the Hudson Valley, in quite a while. Certainly since then, we haven't had any flooding that bad. But this year, as most of you know, the hurricane season, we had more named hurricanes this season than we've ever had before. And often our Northeast rainfall in the late summer and fall is tagged to the sort of remnants of those hurricanes. And of course, Lee and Irene were both hurricanes that ended up crossing our area. And this year, we kind of lucked out because we were coming out of that horribly dry summer this year. And the remnants that we got from a number of the hurricanes that were pretty damaging in the south were actually just beneficial rainfall for us. So we ended up benefiting from the rainfall events that we had this year, or from the hurricanes that occurred this year. But nonetheless, Sandy has occurred since then, but Sandy didn't hurt us too terribly here in the Hudson Valley, but certainly along the coast, it was devastating. So the increase in hurricanes is part of what is leading to this increase in extreme rainfall events. Some people might say, on the positive side, the season length is predicted to increase. So we might be able to change varieties or use later, longer maturity classes of maize, or plant other things that we can't do at all yet right now because we don't have a long enough season for it. According to the predictions, again, from the US Global Change Research report, in the mid part of the century, under the low scenario, the RCP 4.5, we're expecting 20 to 40 day lengthening to our growing season. But in the more extreme case, end of the century and the RCP 8.5, we're looking at potentially 2 months more of summer. And it's not all a positive story. One of the things that a lot of people around here have been experiencing is, because there's a lot of perennial crops, fruit crops, if we've got mild winters, we break dormancy early. And then because again, variability is out there, we end up with these late freezes, and it can do major damage to these crops, because once we break dormancy, we're vulnerable to freezing. That's happened a number of times in the last decade. And that's something, I know Cornell has a new prediction tool where you can try to use the tool to make some decisions about whether or not you should be putting your freeze protection technologies in place. But this is going to be hard to handle. And then another, example of problems that occur, and as a livestock farmer, I'm aware of this, we're moving more and more toward wanting to outwinter our livestock and do bale grazing in the winter and keeping cattle so we can spread that manure in place rather than have to move manure at the end of the winter. But if our soils don't freeze, you can't do this. You'll ruin your field. So this has been a problem for me, trying to figure out when can I put animals out without doing damage to the soils. So those are a couple of the things that I don't have an answer for, but those are going to be challenges that we need to face. So let's transition now to thinking about strategies to handle this. The way I like to think about it, the sort of 20th century paradigm was to bring in technology to solve this problem, to solve the problem of climate variability, or variability from year to year in weather. Irrigation is an obvious tool. We can just, instead of worrying about when the rain is going to fall, we can just put in an irrigation system and then manage our water that way. Certainly, there's been movement to try to develop drought-resistant crop genetics. I'm not going to say much more about that until a little bit later, but I think this has been frustratingly difficult to accomplish. Tile drains, of course, can help us handle excess water in the field. But the point that I want to make here is that I think ideally we're moving toward sort of trying to rethink the way we manage our agroecosystem. So agriculture is utilizing an ecosystem and managing it to produce certain products. And there are ecosystem services that nature has evolved to handle climate variability, to be resilient. And so this sort of informs my thinking about what can we utilize and enhance in natural systems that are going to give us the kind of resilience that we need in farming systems. And the two features that I will highlight, this is kind of where my thinking is at now. I expect it to evolve over time, but right now I'm thinking keeping healthy soils and improving the diversity in our farms are going to be the way that we're going to manage this. So let me start with the healthy soil idea. Those of you that work with cooperative extension, I'm sure are very familiar with the Natural Resource Conservation Service paradigm of the keys to soil health. They've just done a fabulous job over the last decade or so of characterizing and really pushing this idea for farmers that if we improve soil health by increasing soil organic matter, that really builds the foundation of a sustainable farming system. So they're not just talking about climate change, but beyond that, there's a whole range of sort of services we get from healthy soils. In this particular picture, I'm sort of reminding us that generally what we're talking about when we think about regenerative agriculture and healthy soils is that we want to increase the amount of carbon dioxide that we're sequestering in these systems. And then we want to sort of minimize how much carbon we're losing from these systems. So let's talk specifically about the keys to soil health that have been defined by the NRCS. limit disturbance, cover the soil, maximize plant diversity, and keep a live root in the soil as long as possible. I'll give a couple examples here, but the main idea is that if you don't do lots of tillage and you keep something growing on the system for as long of the year as possible, and ideally you're going to have some plant diversity in what's growing there, that the combination of those strategies is really going to help build soil carbon, but soil carbon is the basis for all of these factors that make a soil healthy. Cover crops, of course, are sort of the go-to practice. Well, I would say no-till came along even before that, but a lot of no-till has been managed without a cover on it for many decades now, and it's can be problematic if you are doing no-till but not using a cover crop. So cover crops are allowing for these plants in the system to be capturing, they're photosynthesizing, they're feeding carbon into the profile, they're keeping all the microorganisms that live down there nice and healthy and fed. And we're also stabilizing that surface. We're not allowing water or wind to remove soil from the surface. So we're limiting erosion. And we're also maintaining sort of an even temperature with that little blanket on the surface. Better yet, though much more cutting edge and not very many people are doing this yet, would be no-till with cover crops. So this is hard because most organic farmers are using tillage to manage their cover crops, because normally you just grow a cover crop and then till it under to prepare your soil for the next year. If we can, get this system down, it's difficult to do, I admit, and not very many people have the equipment to do this yet, the roller crimper equipment. But if we can do this, this really moves us further along that road toward healthy soils. And then the sort of ultimate that I get super excited about is the idea that we could even be simultaneously planting that cover crop along with our main crop. So this is super cutting edge. Very few people are doing this, but I think that it's the wave of the future. We're not allowing that space between our crops to be lay bare. We're keeping carbon coming into across the system, and we're providing a really healthy home. In this case, these are nitrogen fixing plants. Of course, we've got some, looks like berseem and maybe red clover in here. And that nitrogen that's being fixed by these plants is in fact being translocated out to the corn on either side of this. This is kind of, we're just learning how this kind of complexity actually works. You know, when I started at Cornell, we would look at a picture like this, and the first thing is you want to get rid of all those other plants in the system because they're competing with your main crop. But our thinking is really evolving now. It's not competition that we're worried about so much as thinking about facilitating the interactions between these plants. So to zero back into what's soil carbon doing for us with respect to climate resilience, I'm going to point to this one particular service, and that is that with a high soil organic matter, we're going to be able to increase our infiltration of water and the retention of water in this system. So why do we want to do that? Well, you want to be able to capture as much water. If you're worried that your rainfall events are going to be few and far between, you want to be sure to capture every drop of that water, and rather than let it run off the system. So the two ways that we can best do that are, one, to maintain a decent organic matter content in the surface that really allows the water to move into the soil and keeps you from developing a crust on the top. And then, of course, having some kind of either permanent pasture or cover crop on growing on that system as well, and having a system of no-till. What we want to do is you want to maintain all those macropores. You want to keep those root channels and the wormholes and all of those little avenues for water to move into this system. As well as the aggregate structure. You've probably seen, the pictures of holding up the handful of soil and seeing that beautiful sort of cottage cheese style chunks of dark healthy earth. That's soil aggregates, and that structure is really good for letting water infiltrate. So no-till and high organic matter really help make this happen. So we want to capture water, and then after we've captured it, we want to store it. So again, having a certain amount of organic matter in our profile really increases the amount of water that profile can hold. In the left side here, we're looking at a sandy soil. You know, sand is really notorious for not holding on to water. They dry out super fast. But you can, if you increase your soil organic matter from 1% to 4%, you're doubling the amount of water that's held in the plant available water stage in that profile. So that would double the number of weeks you can go between rainfall events in theory. It gets even better with a silt loam, which is already, you know, kind of starts out with a decent water holding capacity, but you can really crank that up by increasing your soil organic matter. So getting water into the profile and then storing it once it's there, and that's organic matter is really going to help that happen. I want to just also mention not just sort of the physical structure of the soil that's enhanced by the organic matter content, but thinking about all of the organisms that live down there. We're learning more and more every day about the role of the fungal community, in particular arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, AMF, let's just call it AMF so I don't have to say that long word again. We've known for a while that as these fungal structure down there, it attaches to a root on one end, and then it creates these hyphal networks out into the soil. You've probably seen sometimes if you dig up a shovel full of soil, you see those thin white threads. That's AMF structures. And we've known for decades that AMF is really good at mobilizing phosphorus and helping to improve the phosphorus status of the plant. But we've learned more with it recently that there's all kinds of things that are moving along that hyphal network. And one of the big ones is water. So in this picture here, we're seeing the root surface area is extended tremendously by having this hyphal network that extends away from the roots. And so that's another reason why you want to use no-till so that you're not disturbing that hyphal network. And you want to maintain living root in the soil all the time because the AMF are dependent. They're obligate symbiont. So they're dependent on a green growing plant for their carbon source. They can't break down carbon from the soil. They have to get it from a living plant. And so if you keep your something growing on the surface all the time, you're going to maintain a really healthy AMF population. And that's something you want. I'll just add one more bit here about AMF, that even more recently we're understanding that AMF potentially influences the biochemistry of the plant and can stimulate drought responses that help the plant sort of manage water as well. So it's so much more complicated below ground than we ever used to think. Okay, I'll shift now to my proposal that increasing biodiversity on a farm can also influence our resilience in a farming system. So ecologists have all different kinds of ways that they think about biodiversity, genetic and species diversity. We can think about structural diversity, in other words, tall things, perennial things, low growing things, creating niches on the farm for other associated critters to live in, overwintering habitat for spiders, for example, to help maintain your balance with respect to pests in the summer. So we can think about diversity in lots of different ways, but the one kind of diversity that is particularly pertinent to this idea of resilience and climate resilience in particular is what's called response diversity. So the idea here is that if you've got a variety of different crops that are not all equally sensitive to hot weather, cold weather, wet weather, etc., it's just like diversifying your your financial portfolio. You're not putting all of your eggs in one basket when it comes to climate variability. And so the example that I like to use, because I'm a grazer, is using diversity in our pasture systems to sort of ride through extremes in climate. And in this particular case, I'm going to point out we've got 3 different legumes in this picture. So we've got red clover, white clover, bird's foot trefoil. There's probably even some alsike in here, because alsike kind of hangs out everywhere. But all of these, so they're all playing this function. They all perform a function in the system primarily of fixing nitrogen, but the sensitivity of each of those legumes to the weather is not the same. So for example, in a cool, wet season or year, my white clover is going to do well. So I want to make sure I've got some white clover in that system. Whereas in a hot summer like we had this year, red clover really stands out. This year, I was just amazed at how pretty much all I had going on in my pastures in August was red clover, and I was so thankful for it. So as long as we've got multiple sort of redundancy in the system that's performing that role, but they each have a different sensitivity to climate, that's going to smooth out our productivity over time. So that's a pasture example. We can also think of this just in terms of the crops that we grow. So either with respect to just different crops, so you might, instead of just having corn and soybeans, you might have corn, soybeans, wheat, and some oats, because they're all going to be different with respect to how they respond to drought or hot weather. Another way to think of it, though, for those of you who plant corn, we've tuned our the maturity class, in other words, how sensitive that corn plant is in its development to temperature. We're usually selecting one maturity class that's kind of works on the 30-year average of what our temperature has been here in the Northeast for a while. So we know that, most of the time that one works for us. In other words, we reach maturity at the right time of the year. But one of the tricks that I think people are going to be starting to utilize as time goes on is to plant not one maturity class, but multiple maturity classes, because we don't know in any one summer season how hot it's going to get, how bad it's going to get. So you want to sort of cover your bases by planting a range of maturity classes within some framework. The other thing we can think about there is that the time period that most grains are ultra sensitive to really high temperatures, extreme temperature, like if we had 3 days with over 100 degrees, is flowering. If we get those kind of high temperatures at flowering, it really takes a hit on your final yield. And so by planting different maturity classes, not everything will be flowering if we do get an event like that, only some of your plants will be flowering during that extreme event. I've included, lettuces here because, of course, the breeders have done a really good job for a number of years in developing heat-tolerant brassicas and lettuces for all the vegetable farmers around, because we want to be able to keep producing those crops in the summertime. So they're not limited to just the cool season, spring and fall. But I think we're going to be able to make use of those genetics as we move forward to be able to cover our bases in terms of planting a range of heat tolerances. You do sometimes take a yield hit when you when you breed for a specific trait like that. So that might mean that we want to plant a range to make sure that something does well regardless of the temperatures. And then I've just added onto this this picture of wheat. Within the last 2 or 3 years, there have been some big breakthroughs in wheat breeding globally, not only here. This photograph comes from Kansas State University, where they've been breeding heat tolerant wheat, but in the international breeding system as well. The CIMMYT has made a lot of progress on heat tolerant wheat. And wheat is one of the, globally, one of the most important grains for human consumption. So this is critical for adapting to climate change. And I'll also note, some of you may, you know, the alarm goes off when you think about breeding. This heat tolerance was accomplished with conventional breeding. It wasn't GMO, you know, transgene technology that was utilized to accomplish this goal. And I think most of the breeding that's going on with the brassicas and lettuce as well is just conventional breeding. So it's nothing to be worried about. So I do think the, you know, variety selection and being able to spread our risk by planting multiple varieties is a way to think about response diversity and genetic diversity as a tool for adding resilience. So let me finish up here. I've taken quite a bit of time. So just to reiterate, with respect to climate change in the Northeast, temperature is going to go up. We know that. Precip, we think, is increasing as well. But the most important sort of take-home message is that both will be marked by extreme events. So it's not just going to be warmer all the time. We're also going to have cold interspersed and dry interspersed with that, the increase in precip. And in order to really start to transition our farming systems to be resilient to all of that variability, I think a place to start is really thinking about making sure that we're building soil health, and then exploring all of the range of ways in which we can diversify what we're growing in our agroecosystems. So thank you. I'll turn it back over to Jim.
That was great, as usual. Nice job. No surprise there. Oh, sorry, everybody. I'm Jason. I'm monitoring the chat, so before you try to run off and go see the sheep or whatever you're doing today, I got to run by you, okay?
Sure.
I'm going to lump them all together, folks.
Maybe I'll stop sharing so I can see.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What's going on here.
This is a huge topic. I put in the chat box a link to the New York Soil Health website, which is an excellent resource. It has all types of different ways that people can care for their health of their soil and their animals and their pocketbook. Anything you want to help, we got you covered. We can handle it. As far as soil health goes for this particular presentation, though, I'm going to run them by you, Dr. Phillips, and just shoot it back at me. So, will droughts be more common in the summer in this new scenario? You can say you don't know. That's okay.
Well,
it's climate,
it's not just that I don't know, it's that they don't know too. I think the general idea, if it's warmer, the evapotranspiration goes up. So your soils are going to dry out faster. So we know that there's already kind of a linkage there. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we don't have, you know, that most of the change in precip that we're seeing is winter and spring doesn't mean that we're not going to see some of that in summer too. But I think there is concern that we definitely will see the kinds of drought that we experienced this summer will become more frequent. Okay. But we'll also have lots of years when it's super wet in the summer too. So the extremes will increase on both ends, but we're going to see more of them.
That's a good point though. So you can prepare for both of those extremes from a management standpoint for livestock and for crops. You just need to prepare for both sides of that coin.
Right.
It is possible though. Okay. That brings me to the next topic too. It's no surprise. We've had a lot of anti-science lately floating around our lives, especially in the United States. Can we trust the data that's coming out of these organizations still?
Oh, I would say absolutely. You know, the observational stuff here in the Northeast, it's guys at Cornell that are doing the Northeast analysis. And, you know, sure, we can trust them. They're us. But I would say the general circulation models, you know, the big climate modeling there are hundreds of scientists around the world. It's not like there's any one who could, you know, surreptitiously like change the numbers or something. Everybody's working independently and they're all comparing notes and saying, yep, this is what we're getting too. So It's not, you know, we can trust it.
Great. That's what I want to hear. That's an awesome answer. And I think it's kind of weird that we have to ask it, but hey, those questions, that's fine.
Sure.
Very quickly, we had this question. I thought it was cool. Why does it rain more over the forest? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, a little bit. When you say over the forest, I mean, there is this general sense that that when you cut down an area, it tends to lead to a drying situation. It
Okay.
gets complicated. It has a lot to do with the energy balance of the system
Okay.
and the convection. You get, if there's moisture, so the trees are transpiring a lot there, and because of roughness there's the ability to move that moisture into the air. And the more you can drive that moisture up, the more likely it is to cool, form clouds, and condense and fall out again. So you get
Cool.
that dynamic. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There's also albedo issues, et cetera. But it is indeed true that, I mean, one of the things that we look at in the Amazon is as deforestation continues in the Amazon, we know observationally and we know from models that it's going to have a feedback on local rainfall, and rainfall will decrease.
Yes, great. Real quick, everyone, this will be recorded, so if we will send out a link to this for everyone who couldn't watch it. My next question is going to be one that we always talk about in farming, because farming is one half production and one half marketing, and that's the monetization of this type of these systems and what's going on. So we hear a lot about carbon sequestration, carbon credits. How is this, as short as you can make this, possible for us to get these types of systems in place from a monetary standpoint? Like, how can we get someone to do this stuff through money? Is what I'm getting at. And our place already doing that for us, like credits.
I'm a little bit of a Debbie Downer on this. I mean, it's very hard to measure soil carbon, to the accuracy that would be required if we were going to pay a farmer to increase their soil organic matter, by a few percentage points or whatever. How do you figure out if they've done that or not?
Sure.
You can go out, it's super intensive. If you sampled it intensively enough to really have a good idea that they've accomplished that goal, it's so expensive to do that there isn't a whole lot of money left over. I tend to like to think a little bit more holistically about it, that we wouldn't just be paying farmers to increase, soil carbon by X%, but to reward people for a farming system that not only increases soil carbon, but for example, crop insurance people could make insurance more expensive if you're doing a lousy job on soil management, because as I just said, you're going to be less likely to lose a crop if your soils are in good condition, because you won't be as vulnerable to drought. And there is discussion about that in the crop insurance world. The US government, subsidizes crop insurance, and we could actually make those subsidies dependent on practices. And even if we can't measure that soil carbon has gone up by X, if somebody puts in a cover crop every year, we can just say that's the thing we're going to look for, and we're going to give you a subsidy on your insurance if you do that. So I like, because there's more than just soil carbon that's valuable about that system. I want to monetize the system, not just percent of organic matter.
And how do you monetize a holistic system? That's really tough because you're
yes, except, I mean, I just gave an example, just even saying cover crops, or if, I'm pretty excited about adding perennials to the system and getting more trees in systems. I didn't even say much about livestock in my talk, but
no, you didn't.
Systems, we have a huge opportunity to add trees. And we should be rewarded for that, because there's habitat value, there's carbon value, there's, animal welfare value in shade, et cetera. So I feel like if we took some snapshots at some of those major practices and just reward people for implementing those practices, that would be so much easier to do than, and we sort of do that already with NRCS.
And that's what we do too. But we're up against a lot of private industry that's going to push things that they're selling to certain farmers or other individuals because they want to make money off it. May not be the best. What you're really saying, Dr. Phillips, is we want to look at this from a holistic standpoint. And that's the way we should be looking at everything in all of our lives. If we can just figure out how to do it, how to get that holistic view. We're looking into fungi, we're looking at farming practices, we're looking at who's coming on the farm and livestock and all these other amazing things we can do.
And habitat value, I keep thinking. Above ground habitat too.
Yeah. Can you recommend any reading or any further resources to learn more about this topic?
Oh, I wish I'd had a thought on that in advance so I could have prepared. What I might do, if you're okay with that, is send along a couple of thoughts later, and
Yeah.
people, you can
We'll
post
send an
it
email.
somewhere for people to, yeah. Right
That'd be
now,
great.
I'm not reading anything super exciting, so nothing comes to mind.
Okay. I think I covered most of the things in the chat box. Anybody want to unmute themselves and have a go at asking a question? We got a few minutes left.
So Dr. Phillips, it's Jim here with Ulster County. So as part of the climate smart farming team, Allison has been chatting with me through email. Just wondering if we can share this recording on the climate smart farming website.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. Hi, Allison. I think she's on the call, right?
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, good to see you. Thanks for having me. You guys
Thanks.
are doing
That was
great work.
Such a great talk.
Thank you.
So we do, the climate smart farming team is planning on doing other climate change webinars. We're in the middle also of working on some climate programming. So the webinars haven't been planned yet, but when they are planned, they'll definitely be up on the climate smart farming website. And we'll also likely share them on the Ulster County website as well.
I see there's a question. Someone named Larry Alfick has his hand up.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much for taking my question. How did you prepare your pasture for multiple legume planting?
Well, I mean, in the initial planting, when I first came to the land I'm on now, there were certain fields that had been in corn, so I had to start from scratch. You just add, I added probably 15 different plant types in the seed mix.
So
But
then how did you actually administer the seed?
with a brilliant seeder was how he did it, using different boxes for the different seed types. You can mix
Okay.
together all of the legume type seeds and then mix together the grass seeds in your brilliant seeder.
So you use some sort of a drill?
Yeah, a brilliant isn't exactly a seed drill, but it's just dropping it on the surface after it. Yeah, but
I've also
in
drilled,
a
I've
prepared
drilled
seed
seed.
bed. You can do it with a seed drill too, especially if you're
Yeah.
going into existing pasture.
Mhm.
But I would say more usefully, every year I frost seed in a little bit more, and red clover is one of the ones that it's cheap. It's, it seems to it adds so much value to the pasture. And I've only had sheep on my system for the last 8 years or so, and white clover doesn't seem to persist because the sheep don't put enough pressure on it. But if you've got cattle, then I would definitely mix red and white clover. And I'm a big proponent of bird's foot trefoil as well, because it has parasite. It helps control parasites in
What?
bird's foot trefoil.
Oh, birdfoot
The
trefoil.
little yellow flower. Yeah.
That's a weird plant because I see that growing on only in certain farms. I've seen a lot of people that plant that. I can't get it to come up. Are you able to plant that and have it?
It's very hard to establish. I mean,
Okay.
especially it was easier. One of the ways that I was able to get decent stands is back when I had cattle and I was just taking it down further and putting more pressure on. But with sheep, my sward was always just too dense for it. It was really hard to get it. If you're initially planting a pasture, I would just pour on the bird's foot trefoil, because once it's established, it'll last. But it's really hard to establish an existing pasture.
Good. Thank you very much for your help.
Sure. Michael Monzillo.
Hello, Dr. Phillips. Thank you for
Hi.
calling on me. Thank you for your presentation today. I'm a geography student at the University of Buffalo, and I have an interest in policy. I'm curious if, in your mind, there are any services or resources that are currently inaccessible to farmers and planters like you that would be helpful if people like you had more access to in the future.
You mean services that already exist that a larger farmer can access, but that small farms can't? Is that what, I mean, if you say services, do you mean things that I'm just starting from scratch, or things that exist but I don't have access to?
Things that already exist that, like you said, a larger farmer might have access to.
To be honest, I don't feel I mean, I'm small enough scale that I'm not necessarily looking to borrow a big chunk of money or something. And even if I was, I think the National Young Farmers Coalition has pushed some revisions to the farm credit so that there's smaller farmers have access to some of those small scale loans now that they didn't used to have access to. But otherwise, I mean, I feel like I do have good access to, Cooperative Extension and NRCS, and I've gotten really good support from them in thinking about management of my system, and that, they don't discriminate large and small. So I'd have to think about it to think if there's other services that I would like to have that I don't.
Probably that's an indication of a good situation.
Yeah,
And that's really interesting. So thank you so much.
sure. Anyone else have a question? We're just about at the end of the hour.
I think there was one in here. I'll see if I can find out. So there's a question about microclimate amplifying the change, and they're wondering if NUA, the newest system, so NUA.cornell.edu has been integrated in this for better, prediction, better, climate action, I guess.
Are you saying
Vince and
about predictions? In other words, could we, the downscaling idea, can we get more accurate predictions at a smaller regional level? Is that what the question is about?
Vince, Your Honor,
Can
if
I
you
cut in? I'm the asker of the question.
Sure.
NUA is the weather stations that help predict for frost. If you go to the NUA.cornell.edu, it's a network of weather stations that you can then make predictions for funguses and bugs and frost and planting dates and maturities and growing degree days and all that information for your microclimate wherever you are. And it's the basis of what many of these apps are built off of. And it seems to be a system that was built and is now being abandoned. I'm looking at buying my own system because I'm 2 hours drive to the nearest station now where it used to be around. So this is, climate change is going to amplify any sort of microclimate effect. The early frost, the late frost, all those things are things we need to be on hand for and ready to deal with.
Yeah, that's something I don't know anything about, and I'm seeing some messages are coming up in the chat with people at Cornell who do know about it. So maybe they'll be able to answer your question. In particular, one of them said that the system isn't being abandoned. So hopefully they'll be able to answer your question about that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Vince, Julie Carroll at New York State IPM has done a lot of work with the newest system. They've just recently updated the models with from diseases and insects through Cornell faculty. I think I have your email through the registration, so I can send you some contact information for the new people at Cornell who can give you maybe a little better update.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm looking at buying a station here. We finally have real internet where we are, so I could connect one and put one on the grid. It's a couple $1,000s, and there's many different options of what I'm available, and I haven't gotten a return call from Dan. So hopefully somebody can get back to me and I can just write the check and get the weather station. As far as the UB person, I'd like to comment that access to markets is something that small farmers or other people do have problems with depending on your size.
That's very interesting. Thank you for making a note of that to me. That's a topic that I'm really interested in.
All right, so I have a little after 1 o'clock here on my clock. I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for speaking today on this topic. And check out the Climate Smart Farming website for future webinars. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.